Glory Cloud Podcast, episode 145. Well, stay tuned for a discussion about the Antichrist this week. Well, this is your host, Chris Cahy, and I'm just letting you know that due to power outages where I live, Todd and I had to record this a little bit differently, so I'm going to sound very different in this episode, but I hope you'll hang in there and listen to it and let us know what you think. So without further ado, here's our episode. Well, welcome back to another episode of the Glory Cloud Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Cahy, and I'm joined by our co-host, Pastor Todd Bordeaux of Cornerstone Orthodox Presbyterian Church in Houston, Texas. Welcome back, Todd.
Well, it's good to be back. I think we're doing much better than you are, according to the news and what you've been telling me.
Yeah, as our listeners can probably tell from my audio quality, we had to switch things up a little bit. I couldn't be in the glorious Glory Cloud Podcast studios for this episode, so I'm recording from my place of work so I can use their electricity and internet. So hopefully you're doing well.
I'm doing fine. We no fires at least.
Good.
But I'm excited about this episode.
Yeah, we're getting back to God, Heaven, and Har Magedon this week, so that'll be good. And what pages do we have in front of us this week?
Today will be 179 to 186.
Okay, good. Well, it's been a couple of weeks since we've talked about this, because last week we talked to Brian Estelle about his book on Exodus. So do you want to maybe give our listeners a running start at what we will be talking about?
Sure, and before I do, let me just mention that the next podcast after this one is where people really sometimes look to Kline for a unique perspective. It's on the Sabbath and the fourth commandment and the day of the Lord, and Kline has gone through some changes in his view on that, and his final change before he died is in this book. So we're going to look at next week his view of the Sabbath, which will be very interesting. But today we're going to look at different portions of Revelation as we've been looking at the interim period that prophecy looked forward to or described between the first and second coming, but especially that time right before the return of Christ. And so we talked about how there is a binding of Satan for the millennium, and for that time the gospel goes out, but then right before the Lord returns, or close before the Lord returns, there's a loosening of Satan, where according to the prophecies there is an apparent victory of the forces of evil over the church, where it seems like the church will be defeated. One final assault against the holy city, as it's described in Ezekiel. And then, of course, Christ counterattacks from heaven. Satan and his followers are doomed in judgment. And that pattern of this loosening and this evil seemingly to be triumphant, we saw already in the time of Noah, didn't we?
Yeah, we sure did.
And so that pattern, as Jesus said, in the days of the sons of, in the times of Noah, that pattern repeats itself before the return of Christ. Things slowly in this age, right before the return, get worse. And Kline calls that the Antichrist crisis. And so what he's going to do now is walk through different portions of Revelation and show how there are just different ways and different prophecies to say the same thing and to point to the same time. And that'll help our viewers in interpreting Revelation to realize that each prophecy is not whole new information, but a repetition of what's come before. So, for example, the Antichrist crisis, where he's loosened for a time, where Satan is loose and he uses the Antichrist against the church. In Revelation 11 is described as 3.5 days. In Revelation 20, verse 3, it's described as a short time. In Revelation 17, verse 10, it's described as a little while. And then in verse 12 is 1 hour. All these are pointing to the same time, to the same part of history where Satan seems to be having control of the world again, like it was before Christ arrived. And so in Revelation 20, the removal of these restraints on Satan is signified by him being released from the abyss. That's in verses 3 and 7. In Revelation 11, the same thing is described as the beast ascending from the abyss and then killing the two witnesses. The two witnesses represent the church. And then in Revelation 11, for 3.5 days, there's our time period again, there's celebration in the great city. And that's the great evil city. And in 2 Thessalonians 2, that well-known passage, it's described as the removal of the restraint. The Lord is the one who's been restraining him. And then the Lord removes the restraint in this short time before Christ returns. And so all these prophecies are looking to the same time, to the same event happening before the return of Christ. And if you keep that in mind, then you won't go off and do strange things with each prophecy when they're really repeating each other. Now, Kline goes on to say the final challenge of Satan during this time is a resumption of the Eden challenge. Back in the beginning, Satan wanted to seize the cosmic throne on the mountain of God in heaven. Here, Satan will act through an agent, the Antichrist. Satan enters this agent like demons, Kline says, entered the swine in the time of Christ, or even the way he entered people in the time of Christ. He took over their identity. Remember how Satan entered Judas?
Right.
And so these beings become an extension of Satan himself. And that's what the Antichrist is. And so Kline calls that a pseudo-incarnation. Satan can only try to duplicate the incarnation. He can't actually do one. And so he simply fills a human being. But it's close in that it's a copy of God becoming man. Everything God does, Satan tries to mimic and mock in that sense.
Really a perversion of the incarnation, right?
Yes, exactly. It's sort of like the Egyptian magicians who tried to copy Moses' signs.
Right.
And so in Revelation 13 it says that the dragon gives his power and throne and authority to the beast, and the Antichrist then exalts himself above all. Now Kline notes it's interesting that the Antichrist receives his authority from Satan, and yet it says the Antichrist exalts himself above all, which means in a sense he's exalting himself above his own master, Satan. And Kline would simply say that is the irrationality and the madness of Satan. That Satan is going to plunge on using the Antichrist because he hates God so much. And so the mimicking of the Lord continues as the Antichrist performs supernatural signs by Satan's power. Just like when Christ appeared, the Son of God, he performed supernatural signs. And in 2 Thessalonians 2:9, the manifestation of the Antichrist is called a parousia, a coming of the Antichrist, an arrival. And again, sort of a pseudo coming of the Lord is that Satan sends his, I don't want to say son, but you get the idea.
Right.
Satan sends one before God sends his son. And so another copy would be Satan gathers a great horde through the Antichrist. And that's what Christ came to do. He's going to come to gather his people. And so Kline reminds us that what we saw in Eden, we're seeing again. There was a supernatural sign in Eden. of the serpent who spoke. Now the Antichrist will perform signs, and like in Eden, he will direct worship from God to Satan. And we see, and we've talked about before, that a large part of the visible church will apostatize from the pressure. And so that's one of the reasons the church will seem so small, is when the pressure is really on, the cultural Christians will abandon the Lord. And then the other pressure, of course, will be actual persecution and the death of saints, as we see happening now in certain parts of the world. But we'll see in a moment it will be of more global proportions. So I think it's helpful to know that when you're reading the 7 visions in Revelation, and there are 7, you're not reading 7 separate accounts of different time periods. What you have is recapitulation. Someone once described it as, imagine a movie where you have 7 camera angles. And they're not all focused on the same person, but it's still the same scene ultimately, and it's from the first to second coming, but different angles, different perspectives, different descriptions of all the same thing.
Sort of 7 different ways of telling the story.
Yes.
Okay.
And some may, like Revelation 12, focuses a little bit more on the first coming of Christ and the resurrection. Others on the church age, others will lean a little more towards this period and then the return of Christ. But they're all looking at the kingdom of God from the first to the second coming. And each one is using a little different emphasis and imagery to speak of the kingdom.
Okay.
Now compare that to some of the other ways you've heard Revelation, and how much easier is that?
Oh, it's light years easier. I mean, I grew up with needing to have the newspaper in one hand and Revelation in the other, and trying to figure out where it all fit on the current timeline.
Yeah, and one of the important points is that the author, John, expected the early Christians to understand the book.
Mm-hmm.
And if you needed a history book or a newspaper of the future, then they really wouldn't understand how would it encourage them. They have no idea what this means.
That's a great point.
But the book was meant to be a blessing and encouragement to them, which means they would understand the symbolism, that it was applying to them the same way it was applying to us, and that it spoke of the future in ways that we've already studied. I mean, we already have the rest of the New Testament and the Old, but it's just going to put it in a little different perspective and imagery.
Okay.
I mean, even Calvin was afraid. That's, the book that he doesn't have a commentary on because he wasn't quite sure what to do with it.
Right.
But I think we've come a long way with good books like Greg Beale's and others.
That might have set the bar. I mean, that is an excellent commentary.
Yes. Not cheap.
No, but boy, is it good.
Yeah, it is. That's the go-to. And also Dennis Johnson has a really good commentary on Revelation, if people are interested.
Okay.
And so Kline goes on to a section showing that this time period where Satan is loosed and there's this persecution is global. Because even now, this type of thing, like we said, it's certainly happening in China. It's happening in North Korea. But it's not global yet. But Kline points out that, especially when you go back to Ezekiel 38, that speaks of Gog of Magog. Kline does not translate that Gog and Magog, as some do, but Gog of Magog. Magog meaning the heights or the mountain. And so a Gog figure, the Gog of the heights or Gog of the mountains. And so Kline notes that in Ezekiel 38, the Gog or the Antichrist sets out with forces against the true Har Magedon. He assembles before God's mountain, often described as Zion there, it's Israel. And so the reason Kline says we can connect Gog with the Antichrist. It's described with beast symbolism, like the Antichrist is. In 38:4, there are hooks in his nose, which speaks of a beast. And in 39, there's the feasting of birds and beasts on the slain hordes, which reappears in Revelation 19. So you have judgment being the judgment of beasts. And so in Ezekiel 38, the first part, that first paragraph, Gog advances on Israel. Israel, of course, picturing God's holy mountain, his holy presence. And he's advancing on Israel in a storm cloud. And again, that matches the man of sin appearing like a son of man, mocking the son of man with power and authority. And the global nature of it is that Magog, there is the capital of Gog, and Gog marches out from there and completely surrounds Zion. And so in the vision, you really have all the forces everywhere around Zion. And of course, in Revelation 20, matching that, the Antichrist forces are in the four corners of the earth, surrounding the beloved city. So again, that shows the universal dominion of Satan before Christ returns. Before Christ's return. And so there's a universal mustering of armies in Revelation, and that's given as a chiasm, which again, chiasms are really tough when you're not looking at it on paper. But in Revelation 12:9, the dragon is introduced as the enemy of the church, and he begins persecuting the church. And if you want to match the chiasm, in Revelation 20, it's the dragon who reappears again. B in the chiasm would be, in Revelation 13, the beast is introduced. And now down to D, matching that, in Revelation 19, the beast is also back again. And in Revelation 16, right in the middle, the C, you have the dragon, beast, and false prophet all together. Sort of, you have Satan, the Antichrist, the false church, the governments of the world, all against the church. And so Kline says, if you want to understand the imagery of the book of Revelation, besides the book of Daniel, one of the key passages is Ezekiel 38 and 39. That the Lord was borrowing from that vision because the believers already knew Ezekiel 38 and 39 and simply brought that vision back and added some more imagery.
And I know it's difficult to visualize the chiasm when you're listening to the podcast, so I will reproduce it visually on the show notes page for our listeners.
That's helpful. So, what do you think about this idea, Chris, that people struggle with this, that should we expect things to keep getting worse? Is that the understanding? Is it sort of an anti-post-mill, where things get worse and worse? Or is it possible things could get better, but something very unusual is going to happen in the last days before Christ returns? How do you understand all this?
It's tough. I mean, I want to leave open the possibility that things could get better before something really horrible happens. But I think that the things that we've been discussing, coupled with that, I suspect that short period of time that you were talking about toward the beginning there, in different places in Revelation, 3.5 days, short time, little while, 1 hour. I think that the combination of those things tends to have people looking around them, in their lives going, this is it, this is the end. And it seems like every generation is tempted to think that the Antichrist has come. So it's like we're hardwired maybe to think that things are getting worse and worse. I don't know. What do you think?
It's really tough because you look at the 20th century. On the one hand, more people professed Christ in that century than any century previously.
Mm.
On the other hand, more people died for their faith in the 20th century than any century previously.
Wow.
So what do you do with that?
Yeah, I don't know what to do with that, honestly. Um, uh, I remember it wasn't only Steve Baugh, but for some reason what he said really stands out in my mind. I think all of the professors that I had at Westminster really reinforced this idea that there is nothing as far as what the Bible tells us to expect that would keep Christ from coming back right now. So, it's not like there's some prophecy yet to be fulfilled. He could come back as we're recording this podcast right now.
So here's a question for you then. I'm glad you have to resolve all these, by the way.
Yeah, me too.
If we are to expect Christ that he could come back at any time, what about what we've been talking about? We don't yet see a worldwide persecution that Kline has been describing, that Revelation describes. And so if he came back now, then wouldn't we have to say that hasn't been fulfilled? What do you do with that? Or is there a way to say that the day of the Lord includes all these things and it could happen quickly, but that would still exclude him from coming back right this second? So what do you do with these prophecies of an Antichrist and a worldwide persecution, and then harmonize that with he can come back tonight?
Well, first I'd like to thank you for an easy question.
Next one, if next it'll be on the 49ers.
Well, I really liked what you said the last time we were talking about God, Heaven, and Har Magedon. Maybe it wasn't the last time, but I mentioned a theonomist that had pushed back on me about, well, how much are you suffering? And I think you mentioned a passage from 2 Corinthians. Is that right?
2 Timothy.
2 Timothy. Okay. And so, there's a sense in which we are suffering, and yet I really feel like to say that about myself is an insult to my brothers and sisters in the faith in places like the Middle East or even China.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. If you can define persecution, because persecution can come from family.
True. Yep.
It can come from the visible church. All kinds of things. I'm only wondering, though, because there seems to be a loosening, and so many, the church seems so large around the world still.
Yeah, you're right. And it's also an excellent point that things can change very quickly. I don't know about you, but I feel like just the social atmosphere where we are in the United States changed almost overnight a few years ago, just in terms of not just toleration, but the need to celebrate and promote certain kinds of sins that wouldn't have been imaginable. It felt like the day before. So that changed quickly. And, I kind of do suspect that if pressure came that quickly, if persecution like our brothers and sisters in the Middle East and China know persecution were to come here in the United States, a lot of people who might profess faith might profess otherwise in order to avoid that persecution. That's just my sense. I'm thinking of like the big mega churches where there really isn't a lot of sound teaching. It's more just cool music and stuff like that.
Wouldn't you love to have Kline here? We could ask him this question.
I would love to hear what he would have to say about this.
I think that'd be so helpful. Well, we're going to close this section where Kline considers this understanding of these prophecies in Revelation pointing to this final Antichrist crisis and the implications then for our understanding of the millennium. We talked a little bit about this 2 weeks ago. But if you understand Revelation 20, Kline writes, is not new info about a new event, but a recapitulation or repetition of a previous Antichrist prophecy that we've already seen throughout Revelation, then we don't have to come up with a pre-mill solution that Revelation 20 is describing an isolated episode, an isolated age, not yet mentioned, which is what the pre-mills have to do. But a proper understanding sees that the Har Magedon battle ends the millennium in Revelation 20. Once that battle is won, the 1,000-year is over, and the new heavens and earth begin. So there's not a new isolated millennium that's coming. That would be Revelation 20, introducing a whole brand new concept right at the end of the book, instead of returning to what we've already seen in other language. And so he critiques the pre-mill view, and then he ends critiquing the post-mill view. That's not a shock to you, right?
Not at all.
So he says there's no post-mill expectation either, because there's no outward kingdom of glory during this time. The only outward kingdom of glory in the book of Revelation is when Christ returns. Certainly in Revelation 11, the two witnesses representing the church being killed there's no outward glory in that.
Right.
And then he ends with this point that ironically, the post-mill theonomic kingdom ideal is when the church and state are both propagating religion. Of course, the church from one perspective, the state from another, but they're both propagating religion. That's their kingdom ideal. Kline says the irony of that is in Revelation, that idea is anathematized. Because that's the harlot Babylon church that does that.
Yep.
It's in Revelation when the church and state come together, it's for evil.
And I mean, I don't know about you, but that's not hard for me to believe.
Yeah. And Kline, well, I was going to read Kline's quote here. This post-mill ideal where church and state come together is a monstrous perversion of the true church.
Yep.
But I'm sorry to interrupt you. What were you going to say?
I mean, I was only going to restate what you were saying just a little bit differently, but I mean, it seems like when we see the church and the state get in bed together that nothing good comes from that.
Yes, I don't know why those who think that the church can run things and the state can enforce Christianity, whenever anyone gets a lot of power, usually with fallen man, even Christian man, it never goes well.
Right.
Power's a dangerous thing. And history has sure borne that out, hasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'm thinking of the area of study that I was involved in, almost a decade ago now. But I mean, the Puritan experiment was a failure. They got the reins of power in England for a while, and it was not the glorious golden age that anybody thought it would be.
And the same thing happened in New England. The Puritan experiment in New England lasted about a generation and a half, and it fizzled.
Right. Yeah, and nobody looks at that and says that it was a success.
Yeah.
So.
But it is interesting that when we read Revelation, what we don't want is the state getting in bed with the church.
No. Gosh. That's absolutely true.
But I hope this time has been helpful to have an understanding of Revelation, that it's not too difficult when you understand it as showing the entire kingdom age as it leads to the second coming, and we don't have to separate these visions and saying something brand new in each one, but they're all revealing the same truths.
Very good.
And that was a short episode, but I would say that next week on the Sabbath is pretty long, so we'll make up for it.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you brought it up. And I mean, I hate to describe it as warning our listeners, but it is important. And Kline was not afraid to go where the biblical evidence took him. So I would really encourage our listeners now to be prepared next week to take extra time listening to that episode, maybe with pencil and paper and a Bible nearby to work through it with us.
Yes.
All right. Well, thanks, Todd. I really appreciated this discussion.
Thank you.
All right. We would love to hear what you think about this, so please do email us at glorycloudpodcast@gmail.com. You can tweet at us. I am at Machen Guy. Todd is at T Bordeaux. The podcast itself is at glorycloudpod. I am also on Instagram as at Machen Guy, but you can join the discussion at the Meredith Kline Facebook group. Just let the admins know that you listen to the podcast and they can get you added. And Todd and I will be back again next week with a Sabbath discussion from God, Heaven, and Har Magedon. See you then.